Welcome back to Highly Respected. I'm your host, Scott Greer. And once again, it is Monday, so it is a regular episode for you guys today. And you won't believe this, but it's going to be another incredible episode. And we're going to go over some of the topics that we've been hearing a lot about in recent Highly Respecteds. You know, just when I thought I was out of talking about the Civil War and secession, they pulled me back in. The mainstream conservatives are talking about a national divorce and secession once again. And, you know, just when I thought I was out, I'm like, I'm leaving that life behind. I'm like Batman at the end of Dark Knight Returns. Like, I'm jet setting around. I'm not going to talk about Civil War and secession. Okay, if people have been reading my Twitter, you know that's not true. But I've realized that a lot of people have been hearing these takes from me on the podcast in both the regular episodes and the high IQ supplements. But I'm pulled back in. There's just so much more to say, and due to this response to last week. And if you guys have been noticing the news or been following Twitter or social media, you've been seeing that there was a ton of talk of national divorce and secession last week. There was a poll that showed that over 50% of Republicans would like to separate or divorce. I forget the exact term, but they would like to separate. And roughly like 40% of Democrats are fine with them leaving. And people are like, yes, this is finally happening. Secessionism is the moment. Like, this is what people want. People want to separate and move away. This is the national divorce we've been talking about. And there were people like, this is getting mainstream attention. Like, New York Post had an article saying national divorce is unfeasible, which is true. And then there was a response to that by David Reboy on his Substack. David Reboy is like a Claremont associated guy. He's clearly influenced by a lot of nationalist ideas and stuff from the distant right, but he puts it in a different direction, which is fine. But he had this whole column like national divorce, it's worth every penny, no matter the cost, we need national divorce. And you read the column, and it didn't really argue for why it'd be worth every penny, but he's just like saying this. So all these people are feeling very invigorated that we need national divorce. I think Jesse Kelly was also having these viral tweets about it again, and everyone's just like, we're having a divorce. So there's some problems with this. Like, I didn't necessarily address the national divorce part. I mean, that is dealing with secession and Civil War and stuff. And so I don't want to bring in the Civil War element because they all say, like, we do not want Civil War. We want a peaceful separation. Or even when they say, like, we don't necessarily want a formal separation. We just want greater autonomy for red states and stuff. And which is stuff that I say, or counties separating from red counties separating from blue states and stuff like that. That's stuff that I've supported and said that that's fine to back, and those are serious options and realistic options that have a lot of popularity. But it goes back to this idea that it's time for us to leave, and this is like the grand idea for the right now is the national divorce. And there was always this thing that with George Sorel, who was this French right. Well, I guess he's kind of an interesting writer because, it's hard to pin him on the right or left. Both right and left claim him. Both fascists and like socialists and anarchists have claimed him. And he thought that the class revolution was the grand idea. The general strike was the myth that would unite the working class to overthrow their corrupt rulers. And he was very into this idea that there needed to be a myth to guide these people. The grand idea is me giving him a phrase, but that's what I like to say, like grand idea, myth, you know what I'm saying, is that's the idea, is the general strike, is that all the workers they're not showing up to work, they're going on strike, and they overthrow the system and impose their vision on society for their country. That's the grand idea. And there's been many people who've had this. I mean, the communists had, the proletarian revolution, the worker state. It's what they were working for. They were working for the Marxist grand vision. That was their grand idea. That was whatever that guided the revolution. And really for most recently, and what's dealing with like the dissident right is like the alt-right of 2015, 2016, 2017, their grand idea was the ethno-state, which looking back was very ridiculous and really animating nobody. But that was like their, Sorelian myth that they wanted to rally around and support. I was like, this is what's going to motivate people, and it turned out that that's not really what people want, and it's kind of it's completely unfeasible. And I think the people that they would put in charge of ethnostate, I think most people would just prefer to stay within the globalist American empire if they were given the choice of being led by the people who were guiding the alt right at the time. So that was their myth. And there's been many, many other, political movements that have had myths of some sort of, independence movements, imagining it like their state is independent. But now with, you know, it's really is populist thing with and a lot of conservatives. Instead of like, it's very similar. They're relating to national divorce in a very similar way that the alt right was relating to the ethno state. They're not really defining of how this is going to work out. They're not talking about like how this is going to, why people want to have an ethno state or why people want to have a national divorce. They're not really, they're deciding to wave out of the hand. Like they're saying, no, this isn't important. All your objections don't matter. This is what we need. This is what the people want. And so their grand idea is the national divorce, which there's, as I said it previously, and I said I was going to talk about, there's a lot of issues with this. In the same way that it's like the ethno state, I guess you could say, and one of the things that I want to point out that is, this is not really like that grand or inspiring of an idea. It's not a revolutionary idea. You could say on a theoretical level that like the ethno state or whatever, because it was like imagined as this like space utopia. We're going to space. We've got this incredible technology. All the social ills of modern America are gone, and it's like it's like this dream society. This is what the alt-right said, that this is what we want. And there's like a grand vision of that that's similar to what the communists were promising in the early 20th century. It's like, we're going to have this society where you no longer have to worry about the bourgeoisie oppressing you, and you no longer have to worry about where you're going to get your next meal, and you're not going to have to worry about this persecution. Like, we're going to have a classless society. The proletariat are finally going to have their say and their control over what is happening. We have complete equality, and that was an appealing idea for these people. With national divorce, it's much more mundane. It's like, I really don't like my neighbor, and now I want to live in a country where I don't have my neighbor. And that's what it really all boils down to. It's not like a grand vision. If they ever went into the fantastical ideas like the alt-right or communists went into for their grand ideas, like, it'd sound ridiculous. It'd like, oh, once we have a national divorce, we'll be, have space colonies in Mars, and like we'll be like the Jetsons. We'll be having those hovercraft, getting around in a hovercraft or whatever, and we'll all like feel proud to be in X state. They can't even define what like is divorcing over. They can't define what are the sides in the couple. Like, that's another problem. It's like this metaphor of divorce. In a divorce, you have a clear couple there. There are two people in a marriage. You know who they are. They're very defined. Like, it's like Sally and Tom. Like Tom and Sally, you know who Tom and Sally are, and they're separating. There is no clear idea of who is separating here. Like, what are the sides? And they don't even say this. They just say the vague, like, blue staters or libtards, and the other side is like Republicans or gun owners or stuff. And it's like a very vague sense of identity that they don't really identify. And then once again, they just like dismiss. They're like, oh, that's not important. We'll figure out the sides later. It's like, if you're saying a national divorce and you're using this term, and that alludes and evokes the idea that there are two clear sides in this couple, and that they're just clearly separating. There are two different people. It's time to move apart, but you can't even define the different people. And it's like, it's just a weird thing to think about. It's like, yeah, if you have a divorce, there's Tom and Sally's there, and now we have, who are the two sides in this? They can't identify that. And going back to the grand vision of this is like, what are they promising? And what they're really saying is, like, in all these columns, is like, you can have all these things. You can have the cities, you can have the coastline, you can have like all our industries, but we need to get away from you, terrible neighbor. and we'll just settle with what it is. And it's like you're promising a worse life for the people following you along on your national divorce. And if you don't have cities, if you don't have the coastline, you are cutting off a lot of the economic power that you have. And now all these people who believe in separation believe we can have a 21st century society and economy if everyone's a farmer. And even though only about 1% of working Americans are involved in agriculture, and a lot of them are, working, that's like including people like processing plants, I believe, you know, most Americans aren't farmers. And it's just like you're wanting us to return to the like early 19th century with this. And that's just not going to work. And then most of these people aren't even serious about that. But when they are talking about this in national divorce, it's like very similar to like, a normal divorce. It's like you can have the house, you can have the kids, you can have my bank account, but I just need to leave you anyway because I can't stand you. So you're getting screwed out of all these things, and it's like you're in your bachelor pad, you've got your mattress on the floor, you've got like a pizza box out that's been sitting out for a week, and it's not a nice neighborhood. That's like the state that's imagined by these guys supporting national divorce. Is like the wife gets all the nice stuff and like the bank account and the house and the kids, and you're just left alone in like some studio apartment with a mattress on the floor as the only furniture. And that's really how you should imagine this divorce, is like the blue staters get all this great stuff and the red staters are left with nothing. But for some reason we think this is great because we no longer have to deal with our nagging wife, which and a lot of this relates to the people who are the biggest advocates of this live in blue cities. Like they may live in red states, but they live in blue cities. They're like living in New York City, they're living in LA, they're living in Austin, they're living in Miami. This is all them complaining about their neighbors. Like that is what's driving this, is that they have like these horrible libtard neighbors who like have Black Lives Matter flags outside their lawn. They've got hate has no home here. And they're like, I need to get away from these people. There is good news. You can get away from these people right now, but these people are not choosing to do that. And where do they think their urban city is going to go in a national divorce? All those people there don't want a national divorce, and they all see themselves on the blue side. They may reside in a red state, like if it's Austin or Miami, they may think that that's like, that's a red state, but they don't have anything in common with rural Texans or with Floridians who live out in the Panhandle. They have more in common with people who are living in New York City or LA or Chicago or DC. That's where they align with. And there's also a lot of people who argue for national divorce in DC. And if these people really were serious about this, they would be in the process of separating from their libtard neighbors that is driving them to support a national divorce. It's like, I can't live in a country with you. Well, you can pretend these people are, or you can at least live in a place where they're not around, and they choose not to do that. And there's like good reasons. I mean, there is like sustainable reasons. Like these people would not fit out in like rural Nebraska or Kansas or Oklahoma or wherever. They're not going to fit out there. That's not like they're part of their habits. They do have a lot in common with like people who live in cities. They enjoy similar music and similar. They like the nice restaurants and the entertainment and the joys of city life. They enjoy that, but they just have different politics, and that is an important difference. But they don't, it's fundamentally unserious if all these people are living in like in areas surrounded by liberals. And the reason why they're driving this is that they have to interact with these people a lot, much more than, people living in a small town in America. And instead of like saying like, well, this is a giant country, I can get away from these people relatively. And they don't do that. They just want like this national divorce. But it's like, well, what's going to happen? Are you moving from your city? Are these people like getting moved? Like the libtards are getting moved out of Miami? Like where are these people going? Like, so that's like another thing that the people aren't considering, is that the people who are advocating this are, not moving. They're not moving with their feet. And one of the places that is like really behind this stuff is, even though Claremont Institute isn't necessarily fully endorsing civil war, they do play around with the national divorce idea. And their president, Ryan Williams, who's like a decent guy, he's like says some interesting stuff. He did this long interview with the Atlantic about this, and he's like, well, he's talking about like we're heading to a civil war, we're trying to avoid that, it's so terrible and stuff. And it's like, I mean, first off, I don't think we're heading there. And but the thing is about Claremont is they're located in California. Like, and some of their people are moving away from California, but it's like you're in the belly of the beast. And it's like you can't advocate. Like, if you're advocating for a national divorce, I think you have to live in a place that you would fully trust would stay in your territory that you think belongs to your side. And these people are all living in areas that belong to the enemy. And that's why they drive it, because, I mean, they're just like, as for understandable reasons, they see these idiots walking around and they're just like, I can't believe I'm in the same country with these people. But instead, they still enjoy where they live for the most part. Some of these people do complain, but they have to stay there for work or for various reasons that they're stuck in these places. But other people have chosen these places to live, and they really enjoy it and they advocate for it. And it's like, you gotta show you're committed to this with your feet. And back to the general idea of calling it a divorce it is under this assumption that it's like a bourgeois or middle class agreement with people. It's like we peacefully, we're shaking our hands, we're signing the contract, we're leaving, we're signing the agreement, like we're out of here, we can live our lives the way we want. And it's also this imagining that life can carry on just the same as always. Like, you still have your bank account in the same bank. You still have, driving to your job the same way. You're still like living in the same house. Like, all these changes, everything is the same, but now you're suddenly in a new country where everything is running just the same. But now you no longer have to pass by a hate has no home here sign because the libtard got deported to the blue zone. And that's like, wow, this is so much better that we now have a national divorce. And that's really what the assumption is like life carries on the same. Or that there's like some radical changes, like now your schools are just teaching how MLK was like based or whatever. Because that's the one thing before I carry on back to national divorce, I do want to segue on this. Is like all these serious assumptions of this, rely on the belief that Republican leaders, like these state leaders we already have, are going to be the ones guiding the separation. And that is the realistic assumption. Like, the people on the internet are like, no, they're not going to do it. It's going to be us, like these randos on the internet who don't even meet people in real life and aren't doing anything. We're somehow going to be the leaders and we're going to know how to run everything. And it's like, no, you're not. Like, people are not going to assign you authority in this, but people always imagine that there's like a breakdown authority and there's a chaos, and they're like, you know who we should turn to? White nationalists on the internet. They're like, that's a brilliant idea. We're going to trust them now because they've been so successful over the past 5 years in having a serious movement. This is who we're going to trust is far right people on the internet. And these internet nons off the internet will come out of their homes and they're like, oh, we've been waiting for you. You know what to do. And they're like, I know exactly what to do. I have a ton of experience leading people in real-time strategy games. We're covered here. And they're like, thank God, we're on our way to victory. And so that's what some of these people actually believe, that there's like going to be somehow institutions created overnight that are going to guide these people. And it's like, that's just like fantasy. Like, we can't even start new groups without them like being deplatformed, much less start a new government with that people are somehow going to support. Like, it's somehow going to have the authority and legitimacy to lead people. Like, that's not happening. Okay. So the realistic solution idea is to think that these state governments will like begin to gain a spine and then lead the fight against them. And, I was talking about this idea with people, is that like the red zone, or whatever you want to call it, I guess the red zone is the best way to say it, would not be really that great. It would, like, think about all the cornball conservative crap that we see all the time, like how Martin Luther King was secretly a Republican and like how Israel is our greatest ally. This is what the red zone would dedicate to itself. Like, they would like, we need to separate so we can give more money to Israel. We need to separate so we can give them more military technology. We need to separate so children learn the real story about the Democrats. Like, instead, it's like our history class is like, did you know where racism came from? The Democrats? Like, it's like our new history is like critical Democrat theory. And that's like what that's they learn about these demonic creatures that no longer exist in the red zone. They're called Democrats, and they're responsible for all these terrible things. And they would probably have like the same immigration policies, but now they would know that these people are true Americans, and they're coming to the schools to get a real education, a real patriotic education, and they'd welcome them in like they're like it would be like just like and people always get mad like, oh, Christy Nome and Asa Hutchinson, when you say they're leading, that's a non sequitur, that's just not important. No, it won't. It would be internet anons who have no experience running anything who would be running our government. And it's like, no, okay, these types of people would be doing this. So imagine like Greg Abbott or even Ron DeSantis. Like, people think like Ron DeSantis stuff called Dio, imagine them running the government, and how, like, what would that be like? And you see their behavior right now, and then that'd just be taken to another level if they were running their own state and free of the federal government. And you got to be like, is this really what I want separation for? And it's like, I'm separating so I can have like my kids learned critical Democrat theory in elementary school, and that we can give more money to Israel. And we're now like, we're now like trying our best to like, I don't know. They just like have so much ridiculous things in it. Like, just every ridiculous thing that you would imagine that they would have had would now be I actually know they would take in more Afghan refugees, because that's what every red state governor wanted. Like, wow, that's based. Or they're even mad about like I know this is really off topic, but like the latest like thing that they're mad about Afghanistan is there was like this general who actually did one cool thing out of Afghanistan. He made the troops kick off all these Afghans so they could put like a war trophy in the airplane. And conservatives are mad about this, and it's like, this guy is the only person who did anything to stop Afghans from coming to our country, and you're mad at him for taking a war trophy instead of like the Afghans, who you guys are all complaining are unvetted and are like committing rapes on military bases and stuff, and like you're mad that this guy is like, no, get off, we're gonna take a war trophy and home instead, this like vehicle they captured. It's like, no, what are you thinking? But that's what they're mad about. But that's like the type of things, like all the ridiculous stuff you're seeing Republicans espouse right now, that would they would be espousing to an even greater extent in their own country when they're leading it. So if you're excited for billions for Israel, if you're excited for, Democrats of the real racist history, if you're excited for imagining that are with these historically inaccurate depictions of the founding fathers as colorblind libertarians, then you should be really excited for the red zone. But if you're not about that, then I'm not sure why you're advocating for a red zone, because that's who's going to lead it. It's not going to be disenfranchised internet anons who are incapable of hosting a public event, who are somehow going to like then host their own government. I guess that was a long-winded diversion from discussing the problems of the concept of national divorce. But going back to it, I just find it like kind of silly. It is something that the people most who into it seem to be like Gen Xers. I mean, there's like many people from all these groups, but it is like a certain middle-aged male who definitely knows people going through divorces and separation, and he's using their terminology as like, man, we just need to get a divorce so we can get our own man cave. Like, the country is the man cave, and like their bachelor pad, as I was talking with like the only furniture being a mattress on the floor. That is like kind of the like, the people that this is who are gravitating towards it, who are really into this idea. It's like something that like, they're going through a midlife crisis. They're wondering what's happening in the world, and they're like, man, I just need to get away. I've just, we've just gone too much. Like, the love is gone. The fire is gone. Let's just separate. Let's just go our own ways. And that's not how countries work. Okay. We have a precedent for how a national divorce worked. And people always, once again, people just dismiss it like, oh, that was the 1860s, completely different today. Yeah, it is different. As I've pointed out, like all these states are far more reliant on the federal government. We have a much more powerful military, a much more powerful economy. We have, like these states, there is no independent identity outside of the federal government for most people. Like even regional identity has declined. It's like actually the factors are even worse for a peaceful separation. Like the federal government will punish you if you try to separate. They probably wouldn't even go to war, as I've said previously. They would just like starve you out. They would just like, okay, see ya, we'll separate, and then they like cut them off from trade, cut them off from supplies, cut them off from the financial industry, cut them off from the global economy. They would just like cut them off, and then like all these people are like, well, we'd all turn to farming. It's like that's not gonna happen. And like all your smart people were like, we just lost all our jobs. Like, what are we gonna do? Not saying that there's not smart people who are into farming, but like you're pretty much your entirety of your middle and upper class, and like, well, it's time to farm, boy, city boy. It's time to farm, city slicker. And all these people who are saying this don't live out in the rural areas either. Anyway, that'll go into. I'll talk more about that in my segment, talking about how suburbs are based. But yeah, it's like this is not. This is not where you sign an agreement and it's all like hunky dory. Like this is not how countries work. Countries don't work like a marriage. Like you're in this, and the government has a power of its own, and it doesn't like to see its power dissipate because people are upset that their neighbors suck. They're just like, you're gonna have to deal with your neighbors, or you can move somewhere else. Like you're not breaking up our government. We're a powerful force, and this is gonna cost you severely if you try to leave. And when people are like saying this, like in the Reboy column, he does dismiss this stuff. Like he doesn't really argue for why it's worth every penny. He's just like making up. It's like, well, we need this to avoid animosity, and there's just so much hatred and division, and it is like the reasons you use for separating in a marriage. It's like, well, we're just not getting along. We argue so much, and it's just better if we move our separate ways. And it's like, that's not, first off, that's not very inspiring. It's like we're leaving so we stop having arguments with our neighbors. Like that's not like, that is not rise up to the level of Sorelian myth. It's not something people are going to fight and die over. So they stop arguing with their neighbor, or they stop seeing their neighbors like stupid hair or whatever thing that's bothering them and making them want to have a national divorce. That's not what's motivate. That's not what a real motivation of separation is. And Reboy, he admits like, well, there's a lot of problems with it. Cost of economy, where people think they're located, and et cetera, et cetera. But it's all worth it. Like let's not worry about that. Like let's dismiss it. It's worth every penny. And I don't really think that like that arguments aren't there. It's just like, yeah, you don't like your neighbors. Yeah, these there's like heated arguments on the internet. Yeah, you turn on the TV and it like, it's a very gloomy picture about America. There's not much to be proud of, but most people are going to choose that over like the uncertain future that's brought by a separation, especially a separation where they're getting lumped in, especially a separation that costs them the coastline and all major urban areas. They're like, well, what are we left with? They're not left with much. So it is like, it's an unrealistic thing. And now like to go to the point where people saying, well, this is a positive direction. Like this is moving the Overton window in our direction. It's making people question things that they wouldn't have questioned before, and like think about answers that they wouldn't, they're looking outside the box. And this is what's good about national divorce. And I kind of understand that. Like, I also want to say, like, I think the separation sentiment among Republicans is good because it does make them stop believing these, problem about like, oh, we're all Americans, we can all get along and just get like we're just like hunky dory, everything's fine. No, they do see these people as enemies, and that does make them like adopt more radical positions and less willing to believe in the BS and the propaganda that's pushed by the regime. I don't know, it makes them more hesitant to believe that stuff. But at the same time, so I think that's good that they're doing that. But at the same time, it is not directing their energy towards something constructive. Instead, it's something like we have a solution, just be patient and we're going to have it. It's like, imagine like a street preacher saying the rapture is coming on this date or it's coming soon. Don't need to worry about your problems. As long as you know that the rapture is coming, everything's going to be fine because you're going to be taken up to heaven and this horrible world isn't going to be, you're not going to be in this horrible world for much longer. And that's really what kind of people are promising. It's like, don't need to worry about concrete political action. Don't need to worry about like building things and like working within the system. We're just going to have a national divorce. And the national divorce is like going to lift you up out of this horrible situation we're in. And we're now going to have our, red state utopia after all. And I don't think it is like directing people in the right direction because first off, there is no real, like all the people talking about this, it's just on internet and podcasts. And this is a podcast right here. And then we're talking about what I'm seeing on the internet. Like there is no groundwork being laid for this. And if people really need to read more about antebellum America, about the lead up to the Civil War and what was happening, that secessionist rhetoric was strong for about 40 years prior to the Civil War. And also these people had this idea that the states should just leave at any time, which after the Civil War was set a precedent that like you just can't leave at any time. And as I always repeat, these states were far more independent than they are today. They were not depending on the federal government to solve all their problems as they are today. They had more independence in many ways. But if you look at all the rhetoric, there was serious leaders, senators, governors, congressmen, all their notables and institutions and elites who were suggesting this idea that it's time to leave. There were meetings gathering up all these leaders from the South saying like, it's time to go, or like, well, let's debate this proposition. This idea is just being debated by people on the internet who, it is... they are reflecting their age and stuff and like the concerns of people in their age group and like imagining, and they're putting this in the perspective of like, well, I'm married to somebody, but I'm not getting along with them and it's time to leave. And instead of like a realistic scenario, it's like this city is oppressing my people or my region. And they can't even define what their people are or what their side is. Like there are situations that they want to say, it's like, well, it's all the people who are opposed to vax mandates or vaccines. Well, there's a lot of Republicans who like the vaccines and including hardcore Trump supporters. That's not a judgment call on that, but that's like, that's not like a basis for separation. And many of the people who are very vaccine hesitant are not natural Republicans, so to speak. I don't think... that's so I don't know if you're going to build, a basis of a separate state with some of those people who are not getting the vaccine, some of the magical people who don't want to feel that it'll disrupt their magic. So that's something you need to consider. That's not like a dividing issue. And like other things, it's like it gets like very foggy and vague. Like the South had a very clear idea of who they were, what their issues were with the federal government, and why they needed to separate. They were very clear about this. And they had clear and concrete, identity. Even though there was some problems with developing a national identity, there was still more of an identity there than there is for the people calling for a national divorce. And there was also like clear differences that they had with the federal government that was going to make them leave. Like I think now they can't even figure out the issue that would make them leave. And the one issue I guess would say is like these mandates, but at the same time, like, unfortunately, a lot of the people that they would supposedly separate with support the mandate. And, there is just a lot of issues with that. And I think this is serious stuff. Like, if you're going to be proposing this idea, you do need to be acknowledging and interacting the issues with it. You just can't dismiss it out of hand and say, well, it's worth it. And why is it worth it? We're just so angry right now. We're just getting into so many arguments. It's like, that's not the basis for a new country. And I also want to point out that this idea going more mainstream is not meaning that right-wing ideas are becoming more mainstream or our ideas are becoming more mainstream, or that people are adopting this so they can have a national state. As I stated previously, they just want like goofy GOP conservative country that is teaching critical Democrat theory in schools. That's what they want. I mean, this is what they're striving for. And a lot of people, and we really do have to wake up people to be more on our side in order for us to even want like separation, because there could be a situation where they like deport us for being racist from the red zone, and they're like, you got to go over with the racists, the Democrats. And that's like the type of things that you could see with this. Like all these people are like, yeah, well, we're finally going to get our state that's going to understand our issues. It's like it could actually even be worse than our situation today. And in many ways, it would be worse because you'd have a worse economy and fewer job opportunities in like the red zone America. Now I have some related points to national divorce. I think I'm gonna go. If I talk about this more, I'm gonna be repeating myself from like the podcast I've been doing over the last month. I know some of the people, you want to hear some new takes and some fresh insight. But as I said earlier, I thought just when I thought it was out, they pulled me back in to talk about Civil War secession. But we didn't talk too much about Civil War today. And I didn't want to address that because they always say that they're peaceful separation. So we are addressing them on this point. But a problem I want to talk about that's related to this is the problem of posing, or posers, as I want to say. Now, I come from metal culture, and we didn't like posers. Posers leave the hall when it came to metal. And people always were complaining about posers when it came to metal culture and listening to fake bands who suck or cringe, poser bands. This is like a term that was saying that you didn't actually necessarily fit in. You were posing. But there's like a different type of like poser with this. And I think it's like the best term for this. But there's like a problem on the right where people will say things to say that like they're radical or edgy, and then it's like it's like a pose. It's not necessarily backed up by substantive action or belief. It's just like people posing that like, I hate the suburbs, I want separation, like America's done, I'm post-America, or I'm a post-liberal, and like I actually hate capitalism from the right. And also I'm also care about the environment, but from a right-wing perspective, and that perspective is animated by Ted Kaczynski, which is just like not realistic at all. It's like, this is like taking far-fetched, but it's like it's constantly posing as something more dangerous or threatening or radical or rebellious than you are. And people get into this and it's not necessarily edgy posting or Fed posting or stuff that like we would consider Wignattery, even though some of that is involved in this, because this is a very common thing I see among populace think of just like posing is like posing as these rebels with a cause though, and that they're about to take down the whole order, the whole regime, and like we're coming for you libs. And it's like this posing, they've got their leather jacket on, they're ready to do battle with libtards. And there's a lot of people who get it by posing. And so, going along with my point, I want to bring this back to Claremont Institute, which I don't want to criticize them too much. And I'm trying to say that this is constructive criticism. This is not me attacking them necessarily. And as I want to say, is I've always repeat this in my shows, you can have disagreements with people without like becoming mortal enemies. Like this is one of the things that I stress that the right needs to get along with or understand. But I do want to offer some criticism of Claremont. A constructive criticism of how they portray themselves. Like Claremont, when they are portrayed in the media, you would think that they're like some far right fascist outlet that is looking to overthrow the entire American government, and they've got all these radical nationalist ideas, and essentially they are the like most dangerous threat in American politics. And Claremont really likes to encourage this idea, like themselves. They like to portray themselves as edgy and rebellious. And they do take a lot of memes and ideas from the dissident right. Many of them are old, like they've adapted Vaporwave in the year of 2021, and they imagine that they just invented this. And Vaporwave was big in like 2015 and 2016. I think even by 2017, it was already seen as old. But Populous Inc. has revived it and pretended that they're like the only ones. Like there was like the time, like they hosted a party at like the CPAC in Texas, and it used Vaporwave aesthetics. And then they found out that some DSA chapter was using Vaporwave aesthetics, and they claimed that the DSA chapter had stolen their aesthetic. And it's like, This is like a very old aesthetic on the internet, and particularly in political cultures. You didn't invent this, and they just do this a lot. And now they're unfortunately doing a number on Soy Jack and Giga Chad, but it's whatever. So they're doing this. So there's nothing bad with that. Like we want these memes and ideas to spread, but generally it is like in a misdirection format. And when they do portray themselves as these radicals, as these like guys who are very anti-conservative, and which is mostly good, and there's some people out there who are really putting out some interesting ideas that are definitely challenge the paradigm. People like Michael Anton, I like a lot of what Michael Anton does. But when they're directly asked about what they believe and what they support, it comes ultimately down to the 1776 Commission, which was not done entirely by, Claremont, but it was done by people associated with Claremont and people associated with Hillsdale. And Michael Anton has written numerous articles defending the 1776 Commission. And now, for those who don't remember the 1776 Commission, that was Donald Trump's big idea to combat 1619 project and critical race theory in schools. It's like, instead we're going to have this new education that encourages patriotism rather than anti-white hatred. And you're like, oh, that's great. We want to see what they're going to unveil. And then they unveiled their plan, and it was basic bitch conservatism from the 90s. It was actually just like basic bitch liberalism from the 90s, because it was like, identity politics is bad and was invented by racist Democrats. America is just an idea, not a nation, which most Claremont people realize that that's not good. So they move to saying, they will say that like America is more than an idea, that it is a nation, but they don't really then define it very well. Sometimes for obvious reasons that they can't necessarily do it, but they're not as bad as that. But that's what the 1776 Commission said. And what made America great is its ideas, and the real great exponents of Americanism are Martin Luther King and these other civil rights figures and non-white figures. And it's just like, this is what I learned back in elementary school in the 90s. Like, this is not a radical challenge to anything. This is just trying to hit the rewind button back to a less insane version of liberalism. And it's like, we don't want to return to a less insane version of liberalism. We want something that's genuinely nationalist, that's something that's genuinely different, that's something that actually stands up for this country and the people who made it. And unfortunately, that's not really what they're about, because some of this is their intellectual lineage. Like, they were founded by Straussians and Harry Jaffa, and Harry Jaffa had an ideology and framework that was very very different from what American nationalists are about. And it was like celebrating Lincoln and how these great exponent of equality and freedom and liberty, and using all this language that we would never do. And we would find that this is just similar to what basic bitch conservatives argue for, and even liberals argue for. And they can't get rid of their, they can't scuttle their Jaffeite heritage with them. And then in this interview that Ryan Williams did with Atlantic, and then once again, I want to say that Ryan Williams is an interesting guy. He's elevating our ideas. This is not necessarily an attack on him, but when he's getting in this interview, when the interviewer gets a hold of him and is asking him these questions, he does return back to conservative platitudes, oh, we're just about America's freedom and liberty and ideas of equality, etc. And this is what we're just generally about, and we're trying to tone down the rhetoric and tone down the inflammatory nature of political rhetoric and right now. We're trying to tone that down. And then he's like, Western civilization is just ideas and culture. It doesn't have anything to do with people. And, this is what Conservative Inc. has been saying for a long time. And now I grant that, you can't, you can't say a lot of these things in, the Atlantic in an interview without being called, a racist or anything. And I do know there's a degree of nuance, I guess you would say, that you have to say these things in. But at the same time, it's you're looking at this and it's come on, man, there's more here. And it's if you're presenting yourself as this dangerous radicals who are going to create the new foundations for a radical American nationalism, and then when I'm reading you and it's sounding very similar to what the Heritage Foundation has been saying for 40, 50 years, I'm going to wonder, what's this really about? And so I do agree that they're doing good work, but whenever it's you corner them and you're asking them like, what are you about or what's your belief, and it often comes out as standard conservatism, and that is an issue. And I think that isn't why we do need people who have a greater freedom to say what they want, like people like maybe some guy who has a 6'2" and a 187 IQ to say these things to push people in the direction. Because and I do worry that almost Claremont wants to replace like the energy of people that they've like been elevating. I mean, of course they had a whole symposium on BAP, Bronze Age Pervert, and they positively reviewed his book, and they had some people who criticized it in the symposium, and a lot of people were in praise of it. But I do worry that, like, or not worry, but I do feel like they're trying to say, like, you don't need to read, you don't need to follow any of the people who are saying the things we wish we could say or the truthful things, because, well, we've got all that you need. It's like we've got their store brand BAP, or we've got our store brand Nick Fuentes here, and that's who you just need to follow along. And don't worry about getting into the evil racism territory. And I do feel that there's like kind of that. I don't think that's intentional, and I don't think that's what they're about, but it does come across as that. And it's not really the answer to the problems. And you do feel like a lot of this energy that Populous Inc. does, which Claremont is one of the better fixtures of Populous Inc. And they are still a part of it. They still do good work, but it is ultimately misdirecting people from what are the real issues, which you really can't ignore, like the race and ethnic demographics and identity issues that are there. And then, you acknowledge some of the things that Trump has unleashed, and you acknowledge the things that Tucker talks about, but then it's just like, well, all we need to return back to is the colorblind Constitution and equal rights for all and liberty and stuff. And we can like that, but it's like, that's not really what's the problems here, and we're not returning back to that. So we need like real answers and real solutions and real truth about what this nation was founded upon and what American identity is. And I hope that like Claremont and others, like, they are restricted in what they can say. They don't want to have like get deplatformed and, have Antifa firebomb them or whatever. But we do need to push this into a direction where we can openly discuss these things and not have to worry about being derided as like extremists and getting deplatformed. We have to take those risks to move them in that direction. And that's what I think a lot of what the dissident right needs to do is like to push these people who are taking a lot of our ideas and being influenced by them. But like to emphasize like, hey, like you can't just like take our ideas like Viperwave and then just like imagine that this is a class war, a colorblind class war. Like, no, this like you can't understand what's really going on in America without acknowledging the racial element and the identity element. And that's why we have to keep pushing them in that direction. And there is like, a certain direction that all this is going into that is acknowledging that. So I just want to say that. And it's like, and I do think that like, I want to make a final point is like Claremont, like they always get upset by Claremont's training seminars and stuff. And like a real problem with these like fellowships that they have is like, they're not making them read like interesting books that they need to read. They're reading Harry Jaffa and like Leo Strauss. And it's just like, and it's all complaint. And like Harry Jaffa's books are all like imagining John C. Calhoun and all these other base figures from American history are bad and evil. And like, then these like cringe figures from American history are the good guys and stuff. And it's like, that's also like presenting the problem. Like you're not, you need to, it's time to get over Harry Jaffa. It's time to move on. It's time to move on to the real issues and the real figures who understand what is happening, what's really happening in this country. So I think I still think that they do a lot of good work, but it's worth noting some of the shortfalls, shortcomings, and issues that they have, and hopefully they work to correct that and move the ball in the right direction. So that's the thing about Claremont. Now I want to defend the suburbs, which they need defending. Like a lot of people hate on the suburbs. They think, this is following this like too cool for school, like liberal criticisms of the suburbs. I mean, that's like a part of American intellectual life. Like people have been criticizing suburbs ever since they started becoming a very prominent part of American life after the World War II. He will always hate them. Like they're soulless and they're consumerist, etc., etc. Unlike my big city, there's so much soul here and no consumerism whatsoever, even though there's advertisements everywhere. They just don't understand like real, genuine community. And like this things that said, like I want to say, like suburbs are not the perfect ideal way of life. You can look at places in Europe where there's like nice organic villages where everyone knows each other, nice architecture, nice city streets, and no crime. It's safe, and you can trace your roots there back generations. That's like nice, but we don't have that here. And I want to compare when you compare it to the two other options, like for a family, like if your like dad is like working a middle class job, or and he wants to keep that job, like where else is he supposed to live? Like he's not going to be a farmer. Like everyone knows, once again, like right wing Twitter thinks that everyone's just going to be a farmer. It's like nobody is working, as I want to say, is like hardly any Americans are working in agriculture, and most Americans are not skilled in agriculture. Like that takes years and years of learning and training and expertise to like nail down. And people are just not going to like, oh, I'm quitting my accounting job to become a farmer. And like the wife and kids are like, we're so excited to do this. Like, yes, we're leaving behind everything we like to follow your dream because somebody on the internet told you to do that, and that person is not even a farmer. So this is what people think. And like compared to like the other two options in America, like rural America has nice things, but as I've said before in some podcasts, like it's not this idyllic place. Like it's not like you're going and visiting the Shire in rural America, and that's what people think it is. And like there's some people who are like, there's another way, and they show like rural America, and it's actually like a tourist trap from Europe. Like that's not rural America, and people want to overlook all the problems associated with rural America and pretend that they don't exist, or you're talking down to working class whites when you point them out. It's like there's a lot of problems with working class America, with rural America. Like you go there, like opioid addiction is like through the roof, like drug addiction everywhere. Like most of the young people who were intelligent and were able to go to college left because there was nothing there for them. The young people who were left behind are the ones abusing drugs and the ones with like multiple kids from multiple different husbands, and some of them are they look very different from their parents. That's like the type of people who, like the young people who stayed behind in a lot of rural America. Now, that's not everybody. That's, of course, not everybody. And I know there's some of those listeners who are like there, but this is like a lot of the places. And then you go there and you'll see some of the people, and like they always want to say like, oh, everyone else is fat and whatever. But in rural America, everyone's like fit bodybuilder and they're like doing push-ups on the city streets together. And it's like, no, you go there and it's like you see like morbidly obese people that are like way fatter than you would ever see in an urban area, and probably even in most suburbs. And it's like, all the social ills that are prevalent throughout America, you find some of their worst expressions in rural America. Like, I mean, like the devastation that's wrecked this entire country, it mostly comes to the fore, and it cannot be hidden in rural America. I mean, it's like, close down shops, close down factories, messy city streets, strange creatures that I guess are humanoids are walking around. Like there's like some real nasty stuff in rural America. Now there's a ton of good people who still live there. But most of them are over the age of 50. Because most of the young people who were like, I want to, have a successful life. I want to have a wife and family. I want to live in a nice area. They felt like they had to leave because there was nothing there for them. There's like no jobs there for them. Like the only option they had to leave, unless they wanted to be a Walmart greeter, is to go somewhere else. And like there's not, and even like most of these mom and pop stores that have been around for generations are no longer there. I mean, the whole economy is based around Walmart. And also you have to think is that there is like a lot more diversity coming to rural America, especially if there's a processing plant or there's like a giant Walmart that relies on like an immigrant labor. Like it's not as homogenous as you would think now. I mean, there is a lot more immigration coming there, and they love to put refugees there. And that's of course not their fault. But I do want to point this out, like, this is not the Shire. And then, like, coming with urban areas, with cities, I mean, there's tons of problems with that. I mean, I don't even need to point that out. I mean, there's like a rising crime rate. Your neighbors are humongous liberals, or they're dangerous people you need to avoid. In order to live in a safe neighborhood, it's going to cost you something that you cannot afford if you're trying to raise a family. There's a lot, and cities have been made far worse by the George Floyd revolution. I think there was a trajectory prior to COVID, prior to George Floyd revolution. They were still incredibly liberal, but there was like a chance that they would be nice and you would not have to worry about getting mugged or stabbed walking around. But that's all changed over the last year. Now there's like crime is going through the roof in urban areas and it's affecting people like left and right. Like I know people in New York City and DC and they see muggings way more than they did before. They're reporting more car thefts and bicycle thefts and all types of like a decreased quality of life while the cost of living there is going up. So it's like where you're supposed to live. And it's like, and some of these people were like getting mad about my suburban take. So like, well, it's working class whites just need to move back into their old neighborhoods. It's like, why would like working class Italians move back into like their neighborhoods? And first off, most of them are middle class now. They left their old neighborhoods and they elevated themselves into another class. Why would they move back to their old neighborhoods? Like if they have a family, it's like I'm moving back to a neighborhood where there's like a high murder rate, high crime rate, and people just rob you blind and police don't do anything about it. But I'm going to move into there to take back my ancestral neighborhood. And it's like, and if you even try to defend yourself, the police are going to come down harder on you. I mean, think about what's happened in the George Floyd revolution and how like people now interact. If like you try to defend yourself or protect yourself from the ravages of urban life, like you're going to be the one punished, not the people who are ravaging you or attacking you. I'm not necessarily one of those people who is saying get out of the cities, but it is not all cities are bad, but a lot of them are. And so there's some cities you shouldn't live in, like San Francisco. Like, why are you living there? Portland, why are you living there? Like some of these places, like you could just move elsewhere. Not all cities are bad, and I'm not saying like everyone needs to move to the suburbs. And or that people in rural areas just need to move from rural areas. If you like living in a rural area, then more power to you. If you like living in a city, more power to you. But I think that all this comes together to be like, I hate the suburbs. And it's just something that was like a very American, like liberal critique. Like we all hated suburban culture for a time. And like if you look back at these 90s movies, like they were so anti-suburbs, like American Beauty and stuff. It's like the suburbs, there's like deep, dark secrets lying under the nice veneer, and like we're gonna expose them. And there was like a ton of movies in the 90s throughout this, and it was like a common American trope in American literature and American film, and of course American music, because all these rock bands hated the suburbs. But you have to look about it. I mean, it's not, as I want to say, it's not ideal. But if you're like a white family who wants to live somewhere nice, and they have a nice plot of land, and they can understand it's a degree of safety and they can be around nice other nice middle class people, like the suburbs aren't that bad. Like you're probably not going to be living next to criminals. You're not going to be seeing like dysgenic people that you would see in some places in America for the most part. There is a banality to it. Like you're like, oh, we're going to Applebee's like at night. But as I want to say, Applebee's is actually an incredible restaurant. So that's actually genuine culture. I will use a different restaurant. We're going to TGI Fridays this night. There is like that, but it's the unfortunate fact of American life. Like we cannot have the ideal cities and villages that they have in Europe with American demographics. And people just think we can have like this medieval village with nice historic architecture and structures overnight. It's like, no, you're not going to have that. And also like we have these things called demographics here in our country that doesn't work. And also people, it's like, why I'm moving there, but this is like farther away from my job. And most people are not working remotely. Like most people are still working, are having to go in the office. Like this is it's funny that people like always talk about like everyone working remotely, but this was a thing that was only primarily for like upper middle class people and professional jobs and that's not most people who are working remotely during the pandemic. And most people have returned back to their offices. So, I think, and if you need to work in an office to make money to support your family, you need to be within driving distance of your office, and the best option is usually the suburbs. So I think like the suburbs have like their problems. Like yeah, white suburbanites are kind of being wimps. Like yeah, they got conned into thinking that we should vote for Biden to gain some respectability. Yes, the home of the awful is the suburb. There are these problems with it, but if you're looking at the two other main options like rural and urban, like there are just as much problems with that. I mean, with rural America, if you're from there and you like it there, I think it's fine to live there. And there are some great places in rural America, but there are also some terrifying places in rural America. And people have to admit, like this is where the opioid epidemic is having its major effects. And there is like just a lot of things you're just like, I can't believe I'm seeing this in America when you go out there. And that's not like denigrating rural Americans. I think it's very sad that this is what's happened to their life. With what modern America is, but you have to acknowledge that. I don't think people. It doesn't do any good to pretend that this is like Middle Earth, like that you're just going to go out there and you're hobbits going to be running around. Like it's like wow, everyone's so beautiful and healthy here, and it's often not the case. Like you're probably going to see healthier looking people and better looking people in the suburbs. This is usually like healthy families. And yeah, they might be getting a little too libtarded. Yeah, the wife maybe watches too much MSNBC. But we can work with that. We can change that. We need to push them in a better direction and make them stop being wimps and caring so much about respectability and getting brainwashed into what the media tells them. And there's still a lot of very conservative suburbs. Like looking at like these places with the most fervent opposition towards mask mandates and critical race theory, many of them are suburban counties like with these middle class parents that we keep complaining are wimps and won't stand up for themselves. So I want to say that like there's nothing wrong with suburbs. I think there is like a very anti-middle class attitude, not just with among the right, but shared by all political sides, like all political factions. And people really just like hate the middle class. They hate like country clubs. They hate their culture. They hate the way they interact. They think they're stuck up. They're wimps or whatever, and they don't stand up for themselves. And I kind of understand some of this, but at the same time, like, as I've said before in my Class War podcast, like, the middle class is ultimately our people. Most of them live in the suburbs. Most of their young people grew up in the suburbs. And, like, yeah, they didn't enjoy it. Like, I didn't really enjoy growing up in a suburb, but there was, like, nice things about it. I mean, it was, like, safe. It was just kind of boring. And it's like, I wish there were, like, cooler things around, but I guess we could have just gone to the city to see that. It wasn't like perfect, but it's better than the alternatives. And I think a lot of this anti-suburban stuff is like a part of the posing. It's like, oh, we're kind of like radical, but we're not your typical conservatives either. We're not your country club Republicans. We hate the suburbs just like you, liberal who has a terrible relationship with his father and mother. Like we're just like you. And like just saying you hate the suburbs, most of these people are from the suburbs. It's just like saying, I hate you, Dad. Like, that's what a lot of people like. It's like they go on these bombastic rants about the suburbs. It's like, look, that's where our people are. It's not perfect. Yes, we would love to have better cities and that are walkable and, better communities and stuff. We can work on that. But, like, on the options of where people are living, suburbs aren't that bad. And there is, like, some genuine community in this. Like, some, like, I know I have, like, family, like, cousins who've, like, live in like suburban neighborhoods, and like their neighborhood, their homeowners association puts on all these events for the community events for the neighborhood, and they get to meet all their neighbors, and there's like great stuff for their kids, and their kids get to meet friends of their age. They get to play with them. Like, yeah, so it's like there's like some communities there, and also you can get involved in church groups. Like there's still like a lot of healthy churches out in the suburbs. So it's not like there's like no community to be had. You just have to look and find it. So to reiterate, suburbs, I don't want to call them base, but they're okay. Anti-suburb is code for anti-white. Middle class is base. That's our people. We still want to support working class people. We're not anti-working class. We're not like in a class war. So it's like you shouldn't like have contempt for anybody. But the primary group for the dissident right, which is, as I said, a subsection of the larger Trump movement or the larger America First movement or nationalist movement, whatever you want to call it. It's primarily middle class. It's primarily people coming from the suburbs. hating on the suburbs is ultimately like, a phase that you should get over as you grow older. And it is, suburbs are generally the best option for families to live if they want a safe place and that they can find some type of community there. And compared to urban rural areas, it's doing fine. So I just have one other topic that is like, or it's a two topics actually that I just want to make a quick point on. I don't want to be too long of this. I want to get to the kind of elite question that we have, which will be a short one. It's not that long. Maybe one of the shortest answers to a kind of elite question I've had. But last week, of course, as I like to talk about my tweets, I had two different tweets that ruffled some feathers. The first one was talking about Kristi Noem's alleged affair. This actually did. There was just like a handful of people were mad about this. Most people agreed. Is that I said that the Kristi Noem affair likely wouldn't hurt her. There are other things that are hurting her. I mean, she is like an idiot. She doesn't understand where the base is. She is weak. She doesn't stand up for the issues that actually matter. And she's just kind of like a narcissist and really arrogant and doesn't understand that like people can criticize her and like as a politician you can get criticized and it's not sexist to criticize a woman politician. But she's accused of having an affair with Corey Lewandowski. I don't know what the truth is about it. That's what people are saying. But even with this like affair, I was like, this is probably not going to hurt her. And sure enough, it's really just hurting Corey Lewandowski because he's accused of other sexual improprieties and he's getting all this heat from that. And Noam is seemingly like just saying that this is a sexist attack on her for being a strong woman. And most of the conservative media is going along with it and just ignoring it. And I want to make this general point that like reiterate is like Conservative Inc. is built on simping. It cannot imagine that women are not perfect little angels. It always thinks that anything women do wrong is caused by evil men. This is how they approach abortion. Whenever they come up with an abortion law, they protect the woman actually receiving the abortion or asking for the abortion, but then they harshly punish the abortionist. This would be like, a woman goes and asks a hitman to murder her husband, and the woman is protected from all charges, but the hitman is given the death penalty. That's like how the conservatives operate with abortion and women. And that is a part of that, like that. They are incapable of like seeing women as, what they are in real life. And they always do this type of simping. It's like, oh, you're a perfect little angel. It's not your fault you did this. You have no agency. You shouldn't be held responsible for anything. And it's just these evil men corrupting you. It's like how they approach, like, why are all these women working in Conservative Inc. don't have like husbands? It's like these men, these loser men are just playing too many video games and watching porn when they should put down their video games and go out and hit on this 200-pound woman with a horrible personality. And that's like what they really should be doing and marrying her. It's like, that's how they approach it. It's like all these women are perfect and any man would be so lucky to be their husband. And that's how they imagine. So that's like why like Kristi Noem is not gonna have like the affair is not gonna hurt her. It's like really it still hurts men. There's still some examples like David Vitter, Mark Sanford, Cunningham, the Democrat who ran in North Carolina. The affair that he was accused of the multiple affairs he was accused of, ensured he lost the Senate seat in North Carolina. I think that if the affairs had not happened, it would have at least been a closer race and he may have won. But he did not win, and I think it's due to the affairs. And that's like something that happens with a man. But even with, like, if a woman is accused of an affair, they can still come back from it. Like, Katie Hill has turned her outrageous sexual improprieties into that she's a victim, and now the entire media believes it. And they've turned her into an icon, despite her affairs, which were, like, and she was having sex with subordinates, too. And so, like, and nobody like complains about that. With men, it's still seen as something bad. But while women, it's like it's like they're meeting a need that must happen, or they were tricked into evil men into this affair. So that's like the two ways of approaching that. And that's not just conservative. That's like the media sphere as a whole. But there's a general point about adultery and affairs in political life. Male or female, no matter who's doing it, that does reflect a part of American life. That will tie into the next point I want to make. And that is, I don't think like really affairs and adultery really matter as much as they did 20 years ago. Like, I think if anyone was accused, or 20 or 30 years ago, if anyone was accused of affair, they had credible, accusations of it. Like the woman came forward, she had messages, she had letters, I guess, because they didn't have texting at that time, or some proof that they were having an affair. Like pretty much every politician was ruined by that for the most part, unless depending on the reputation. Some politicians portrayed themselves as playboys or whatever, and like the philandering was a part of their appeal. Like even with JFK, like there was like some acknowledgement that like this guy may be promiscuous. I think if they had known about him doing this in the White House, that would have been a huge problem for him. But it is like going on. Like this was a much bigger problem. But I think today it's like people are accused of like all types of sexual improprieties within politics, and people just simply don't care as much. And I think that is like a change in the culture. Like there's like a hard way to test it. I mean, with Cunningham in North Carolina, like yeah, that did hurt him. But would have it been a big of a problem if it had not happened closer to the election? That is something to test. And I think we're going to see a couple more of these situations where we're going to see like people are accused of affairs, if they're men or women, and they're still going to get elected, and it's just not going to matter as much. And that is something, a deeper change within American life, is that, we're not as moralistic as we once were. And in some ways for a negative, we don't necessarily want our politicians to uphold traditional bourgeois morality and values anymore. It's like they're fine with like a politician. They may be more fine with a politician being a swinger now than they were in the past. But we have to see. I mean, it still can be a problem for them, but it's a bigger problem. Even when it is existing as a problem, it's less so than 20 or 30 years ago. And it's really more of a problem for male politicians rather than female politicians, unless they broke some law and they can't present this as a girl power moment. So this does tie into this with this other point that I made that was controversial. When there was like this, somebody put out this map on Twitter, and it showed like certainty and belief in God. Like certain belief in God. Like these people, like percentage of the world, of these countries, the percentage of their population, how certain they were absolutely certain that they believed in God. And the majority of America strongly believes in God. No, most of America, it's only like the New England that it's like a little like less certain. That even places like California and like liberal places that you would think where there'd be some degree of uncertainty, the majority of the population is more certain. Now you looked at like based Eastern Europe, and most of the countries, it's only like 20-30% of the population that is certain, that absolutely certain that they believe in God, or that they are absolutely certain God exists. And that includes like Hungary, and Poland had a higher number than the rest of Europe, but was still lower than most of America except for New England. It was in the same category as New England in absolute certainty in the existence of God. And what I pointed this out is like Poles and Hungarians are less certain of God's existence than Californians. People got very upset, and they were like doubted the Poles. Like they went into this and they're like this, and they're like, oh, we're a godless country. Like most Americans are Muslims or New Agers. It's not real like religion and stuff. And they just like did all these things. It's like, I think there's like a certain explanation. I don't know why like a lot of American nationalists want to like say that all of Americans are like godless, like heathens, but and Eastern Europeans instead are like all like every Eastern European and Pole is like, every hour or so gets on their knees to play the rosary. I don't know why they necessarily need to believe this. I mean, this is not a value judgment or anything. I think it's just simply saying that like I think our impression of Eastern Europe as this like 100% based trad area where, as I said, like some people imagine that they're like having like every hour wherever they are, they drop to the knees and pray the rosary. That's not necessarily the case. But they do have a stronger public Christianity where it's a part of the culture to have these festivals. Like they have massive festivals that are celebrated in their capital cities. They're major events that are like saints' days or holidays where they do express a strong sense of Christian culture that are there, that are using, crucifix, that is using these symbols that you don't really see in public life in America anymore. But I think the people participating in that, they're like, I'm not so sure of the existence of God, but I am a Christian, and this is a part of my culture, and this, tells my kids not to be degenerates and stuff. So I am a Christian. I may not go often, but this is, part of my identity. This is part of my culture, and I pay my observance to it. But I'm just not as absolutely certain. But in America, I think there's kind of a more lip-hearted Christianity where people who are very, believe that God loves, is like down with transgender people and gender reassignment surgery. They're probably absolutely certain that God exists. I think that but it's a more personal Christianity. It's not expressed in these festivals and processions that they see in Eastern Europe that reaffirms that this is like a more Christian culture, a more Christian nation, because it's tied in with their national identity. With them, like, Christianity is a personal choice, and they can make it seem whatever it believes. And I'm not necessarily saying that the Eastern Europeans are like fundamentalists, Christians are, that they're totally adhere to every part of the doctrine. I'm just saying that it's like a stronger part of their identity and national culture than it is here, even though their belief is less certain, so to speak. And while in America, like, people are far more certain that God exists, but they debate over what God supports or what God's about, and God is more of just like this big friend in the sky who approves all of your decisions no matter what you do, and he loves you no matter what, and only God can judge you, and he's totally supporting your bad decisions that are not supported by any Christian doctrine. And I think that that type of personal God, that personal Jesus, as Depeche Mode may have said, is far more prevalent in America, and it's not expressed in this cultural expressions. I just said expressions twice in this thing, but you know what I'm saying. It does not come out in these processions and this tied connection in with the national identity. So that does create an impression with that. And so that's all I'm simply saying. I'm not, like, people are like accusing me of like, you're bashing Catholics again. How dare you? And then it's like, I'm just simply posting data. I'm simply just saying, like, people need to look at how it works in the real world and, not indulge in some of these Twitter fantasies that people are prone to indulge in. And that's all I'm simply saying. It's not me simply favoring Protestantism over Catholicism or whatever. And I also want to point out that, like, also going along with this is that I'm not also saying that the personal Christian, that like the majority of Americans believe in this kind of liberal Christianity where God's like approving of whatever terrible decision they do, and it's like God is like flying the rainbow flag or like encourages you to fly the rainbow flag, that's who they imagine God is. There is like a very fervent conservative Protestantism here in America, especially in rural America. One of the good things about rural America, despite its many issues, but if you go out in like certain places in America, you will see a very strong faith there, and that you wouldn't see anywhere in you wouldn't see in many places in Western Europe. So it's not all, but there are two parts of that. There is like a very conservative fundamentalist Christianity that's very prevalent, very strong in rural America. And it's very even strong, even some among these immigrant communities. And there's also this kind of liberal Christianity that's also very popular. And all these people just like have have a greater certainty that God exists than these people, than Poles and Hungarians who generally have a strong allegiance to the Christian culture of their nation, but they just have a little bit more doubt about it, and they're not as attending church as much as the Catholic Church wants them to. So that's all I'm simply saying on that subject. But now, moving on to the Cognitive Elite question that we have. As a reminder, you too can get the power to ask me questions or suggest guests and topics if you sign up for the Cognitive Elite option at Highly Respected Substack at highlyrespected.substack.com. This question comes from Manfred, and it's another question about metal. He asked, like, where do I find new recommendations about metal? Where can I get up to date on the music? Now, that's a tough question because I don't even have a good answer to this. Usually where I find out good music is like I get a YouTube algorithm and they just send me like some new album that came out. And there's like some channels that are pretty good, like Black Metal Promotion. That's they have like so much stuff that's like not worth listening to, because it's like, okay, I've heard this a million times. I don't need to listen to another standard black metal album anymore. And they'll just like have any black metal album that's ever been released anywhere in the world, and they'll post it on their channel. But there are like some good stuff in there. So I generally just like find random algorithms. I have been reading some more articles from Decibel, but most of the articles I'm reading, it's like look like a retrospective on an album that they have, and they're interviewing the band. I find that a lot of their articles are good, but of course, like all metal journalism, it is woke. I don't think that they're as woke as like places like Invisible Oranges and Metal Sucks. And I do find that their deep dives into like metal history is pretty good. I probably wouldn't listen to. I probably would avoid some of the new recommendations, because that's just not what I'm into. It's not like the bands I'm listening to, but there's like some bands that I know are like good or decent, and when I see that like something like pops up in my YouTube algorithms and it's like, oh, they got a new album, I'll check this out. And sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not, but I give it a listen. But with the channels, I hesitate to recommend black metal promotion, because they post so much just like mediocre stuff, because there's no quality control. They just post anything that's like a new black metal album in there, and not everything is like good. So I don't necessarily want to hesitate to promote that. For like even like outside of metal, like there's one channel that's like pretty good, that's like Years of Silence. It's like a lot of folk and like ambient stuff that they post, and it's not metal, of course, but it's like stuff that's like metalheads would probably enjoy. Usually most of the stuff they post is pretty good or worth a listen. So I would recommend checking out Years of Silence. So there's a couple of other channels too that post dungeon synth and stuff, which I enjoy, that are good. But their names are not on the top of my head. So I guess Highly Respected might be your best option for finding out about new metal albums. But like, so my taste may be different from yours, so you may just want to listen to other stuff. But I really like people always like ask like new metal recommendations, like what's new and stuff. It's like, man, guys ask me about like the canon, like you know, ask me about like what's like the best stuff, like because a lot of the best metal was released many years ago, and a lot of you guys probably haven't heard about it, and I'm more than happy to share. So in any future metal questions, like, it may be more impactful to ask me is like, what are some of your favorite albums in this, like from this country or from this year, or like what are like in this genre? That might be some that I would love to share some of these questions, because I can or answer these questions, because I can talk at length about them. So that's just my recommendation for future Cognitively questions. So that's it for today. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it. We will have another incredible IQ supplement later this week, so tune in for that. So until next time, stay respected.